السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أخواني وأخواتي الكرام، حياكم الله بياكم في هذه الجلسة من المنتدى الرائع برعاية النادي السعودي في جامعة واشنطن في St. Louis, Missouri. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the session of the Saudi Legal Symposium in the United States, organized by the Saudi Law Students Association at Washington University in St. Louis. My name is Vanderbilt Almohammadi. I am a professor at UMKC Law School. I'm also an attorney in the state of Missouri, Kansas, New York, and the 10th Federal Circuit 10th. And it's my pleasure, as I said, to be here today and be the moderator for this session. And our next presentation examines a fundamental question in climate governance, not simply whether states are committed to mitigation, but whether their institutional structures make mitigation feasible. Focusing on the Gulf Cooperation Council, the paper Structural Lock-in and the Governance Feasibility Failure to Climate Change in the GCC argues that the core obstacle may lie in the structural incentives. Whether economic stability, political legitimacy depend on hydrocarbon revenues, meaningful mitigation can conflict with the very foundations of this governance. The presentation invites us to consider climate change not only as an environmental challenge, but as a constitutional and institutional one. Please join me in welcoming our presenter, Majid Alkhairy from Vanderbilt University. Now the floor is yours.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله يسعدك يا دكتور، والله يحفظكم ويا مرحبا بهذا الحضور الكريم. وطبعا أعرفكم عن نفسي بس جملتين. اسمي ماجد أشرف الخيري، طالب قانون في جامعة فاندربلت في ولاية تينيسي مدينة ناشفيل. وكما قال الدكتور الله يحفظه، our presentation today إن شاء الله is about what I titled the GCC paradox, a study of systemic dysfunctions, structural ironies, and the emerging case for optimism in the world's most critical energy exporting region, which I think, of course, is very relevant to us as Saudis. And we'll see why, touching, as of course the doctor mentioned, on legal, economic, and future-leaning issues, environmental issues, that will affect us all very, very much in the future, and are already affecting us at the moment. So I think I hardly need to tell you gentlemen and ladies about the GCC. We live in the GCC. We have all utilized the GCC. Of course, we know that the GCC are the 6 Arab Islamic monarchies along the Arabian Gulf. That was established in May 25, 1981, to form a coordinated regional bloc, and in my opinion, the most cohesive regional bloc in the world, considering the fact that even many GCC citizens, if you're not wearing your traditional clothing, like kashkush or musar or something like that, you can't really tell what country your brother is from, because we are all brothers and we're all sisters in the GCC, of course. And of course, this was intended to deepen political alignment, cultural cohesion, economic benefit, and many, many other things and aspects. And of course, it pursued this framework for economic and customs integration that we utilize very often. Of course, many of us have been to Bahrain, Emirat, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, so on and so forth, without needing to present a visa or even a passport, because of the GCC. And one of the main points of cooperation that the GCC has embarked on, of course, is environmental, considering our position in the world by God's will, that we are all desert nations with no rivers or standing bodies of water, among other environmental issues. So, of course, just to very briefly touch on the GCC for a point of relevance, why was it formed? Of course, aside from historic alliances, ties of brotherhood and kinhood, the tribal bounds, etc., you also have the fact that there's a strategic political consolidation in the 1980s. The 1980s was a very turbulent time, not only around the world. You talk about the 1980s, you talk about the Iranian problems in Iran, problems in Russia, problems in Germany, East Germany, West Germany, United States. There were anybody who lives in Los Angeles knows the 1980s was not good to Los Angeles. And of course, around the Arab world, because in the 1980s you have war in Yemen, you have Egyptian ideology, you have Libyan ideology, Jamahiriya ideology, you have Moroccan conflicts in the Western Sahara, you have Republican, socialist, and revolutionary movements that are challenging the well-established and very ancient governance models that we all know and understand from a very long time of being ruled by a king or a prince or a sultan or a sheikh or any wise man like that. And so the Gulf states, understanding their position in the world and understanding at this point that they are in fact important economic players and important political players, responded by God's will, alhamdulillah, by reinforcing collective security and political coordination among themselves. Now we're going to talk about the main point in this presentation, God willing, of a structural analysis regarding the environment and environmental law. And I wish to point to this picture, the fact that in none of the GCC countries, with the exception perhaps of parts of Oman in the Kharif, you don't have these kind, and parts of maybe Jabal Aswad and Jabal Akhtar and Faith and so on, in the Kharif only, you have sometimes these sites, but nine out of 10 times in the year, you can never get this site in our countries by God's will, because God decided to make our countries dry nations and desert nations, and this has caused a lot of challenges for us as a people. Now, of course, we are all aware of the nature of the Saudi economy being very much dependent to this point, and inshallah we are seeing it being diversified away from, inshallah, about hydrocarbon resources, oil, natural gas, so things like polymer carbonates, plastics, jet fuel, tar pavement, stuff like that. You're talking about the great ni'mah, the benefit of hydrocarbons that allowed Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries to modernize rapidly. To transition from a time of nomadism, of Rahal and Badawiya, to a globalized central economy. And I want to point to these two pictures to show that the contrast of Allah yahfaz ajdadna, who lived in these kind of camel hair and goat hair tents in the desert, and were very much subsistence herders and try to eke out a living in the desert. And modern day Riyadh, which has 8 million people, has a very modern metro system, highway system, buildings, all kind of conveniences. And this transition happened in only 70 years, subhanAllah. So this is very important to understand that as much as we talk about, the structural dependency, emissions exposure, and long-run vulnerability of hydrocarbons have been a massive blessing for our countries. And obviously, we have the former oil ministry, Allah Hafidhah, he said, monetize every molecule. Now, whether you agree with the statement or not is not important. What matters is that this statement touches on a very critical point, that is the reality of our economies. So, of course, we touched upon this. Modernization, prosperity, and geopolitical influence come from the blessing of hydrocarbon, but at the same time, you get environmental degradation, fiscal exposure, transition uncertainty. And then at one point, you also have rapid consumption, urbanization. You also have resource-intensive infrastructure, escalating ecological footprint. So a very important example is Miyah Tahliya, desalination plants. The fact that we have to get a drinking water in Riyadh 2, 3, 4 hours away by drive through a pipeline. And this is the consequence of our environment. So I want to just touch upon different countries, Saudi, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Emirat, and Oman, about the principal challenges they have, and also the strengths and response initiatives that I have managed to find out for the research for this paper that I wrote, alhamdulillah. So, of course, Saudi Arabia, we all know that water is a very important resource, and we are, I think, the most water-stressed country in the world, because we have, aside from winter sometimes, we have no running water. And of course, we know that the fossilized water in the north, in Tabuk and Skak and so on, and Qasim, a lot of them have been depleted up to 75 to 80%. And some aquifers have been depleted entirely, and that is very concerning, of course. But we have, of course, very strategic strengths, a Vision 2030 transformation program, inshallah, the Green Saudi and Green Middle East initiatives. Kuwait have similar problems, environmental pollution, governance gridlock. Qatar, they have the highest per capita emissions globally ever. Bahrain, accelerating coastal erosion, land loss, unique island problems. UAE, oil revenue reliance is declining because UAE doesn't have as much oil proven resources as other countries. Oman, desertification, ecosystem stress. But we also look at the strengths and responses. So Kuwait has very high highest solar potential in the world is in Kuwait. It's a very educated population from even the time of the 50s and 60s and 70s. Qatar is a sustainable stadium architecture we saw in the Mundial, the World Cup recently. Advanced desalination research and development. Bahrain, in my opinion, and you can disagree about it, but Bahraini people in general tend to be quite environmentally aware, and there's a lot of civic engagement in Bahrain. A Masdar city in Emirates, net zero 2050. Oman is a global hub now for ecotourism development and marine conservation, to the point now it's considered on the top 10 lists of must-see destinations for environmental beauty. And implementation. But we also talk about asymmetries, and the reason I bring up the crocodile is because the crocodile lives in rivers that are murky waters, and you cannot see the crocodile sometimes. So if you try to cross the river, the old story about crossing the river of crocodile, you might get bitten and you don't even know it because you couldn't see the crocodile. And this is the danger we have of going on with climate pledges and in this industrial diversification timeline and transition narratives, but having them diverge across the member states. If the point of the GCC, of course, is to be cohesive and be one body in this world, then we cannot go to the murky water and be divisive. Competitive branding, for example, unity, unfortunately, is often performatively expressed, not for anybody's fault, but it is the reality and strategically fragmented in practice, and this makes us weaker. Initiatives and outcomes, of course, that we're talking about, we can talk about all the incentives that we need for regional coordination, and that's important, and the natural strategies. And we talk about the good programs that have happened. For example, I heard recently some news of the plan to reintroduce lions in some parts of the wildlife reserves in the north of Saudi and Tabuk and Skaka and so on, these places. Because lions, of course, we talk about Sayyidina Hamza, radiallahu anhu, he used to hunt lions. Now you talk about lions, he hunted in Ethiopia and he hunted also in Arabia. And Arabia used to have lions, used to have a lot of flora and fauna that unfortunately became very much depleted or even extinct. And we have, alhamdulillah, this return to this flora and fauna like the Mahal Arabi, which was extremely close to extinction. And now we see their number rebounding, similar to the story of the bison and the buffalo in the United States when they were killed in millions and millions. And now we can see that there are a lot of bison back in Yosemite Park and so on and so forth. So key structural challenges and forward trajectory, we're talking about structural dependence on hydrocarbon rentier dynamics, which is very dangerous. I think you can see Saudi Arabia, number 5 on most dependency known, and we hope inshallah this will change soon. The end of hydrocarbon dominance, we talk about new battery technologies. We talk about molten salt batteries. There's a type of battery which is not chemical, but actually physical battery, where you take the energy initially and you melt the molten salt and it keeps the heat, and then you use the heat to discharge to heat the steam to turn the turbine to generate the electricity. Or the classical battery with the separator and the lithium discharge, positive and negative ions, and the cathode and anode. So we're talking about a great stride in development in battery technology. This will challenge hydrocarbon dominance. Transition threats, you're talking about Dutch disease, which is a major problem. Of course, Dutch disease, when you are dependent on one resource, the whole Dutch disease, because we talk about the discovery of natural gas resources in Holland that led to a collapse of Dutch manufacturing. And we don't want to see that in our own country. Structural rent dependence, shallow private sector development, politically motivated projects that are, for example, in Emirat and Qatar and Bahrain and these countries, that sometimes you see these projects that don't align with the economic or environmental reality. And inshallah, we hope in our country that our projects are very beneficial, God willing. And of course, we don't need to remind you all about the intensity and the increase of the environmental problems in our country. I mean, I was born in 1422 Hijri, 2002 Miladi, and I remember in the winter we used to get hail, a very big hail in Riyadh, and now you don't even remember hail. And this was only 23 years ago. You're talking about predictions from 10 years ago that Kuwait and parts of northeast Saudi will reach 60 degrees Celsius by 2030, and rising sea level, desertification, grid stress, water scarcity stress, etc., which is obviously a very dangerous future that by God's will, inshallah, we don't want to approach. So you talk about the pathways and incomes, and inshallah we'll wrap up very soon. The biodiversity gains and land recovery that we see, that I think is actually the strongest point in our countries because of the cultural significance. Carbon capture and transport, which is very important. You're talking about CCE, carbon circular economy, which is critical because we are hydrocarbon producers. Only 5% energy renewable in our region, even though we have the biggest solar potential in the world. And the irony that our country and Dawla Shaqiqa al-Imarat consume 90% of the region's renewable output, and this is all waste that can be used for export, inshallah. And we're talking about huge potentials and great speeches that are genuinely very true and heartfelt, but we have to talk about real progress in a realistic fashion, بإذن الله تعالى. Thinking beyond the GCC regional frame and a summary of the slide, inshallah, what do we need to shift in our region to integrate carbon capture, water management, privatization, diversification, leverage projects that were present in, for example, 1435 Hijri and 1437 Hijri. We're talking about Al Bayda and Dihama, a project in the Hijaz Mountains that sequestered water and caused very much great benefit for the environment of the region to forest the region without needing desalinated water from the rain alone. A very interesting fact that all the rain that fall in winter in Saudi that fall into the sea can irrigate the whole country بإذن تعالى for the entire year. It's very important to invest in this. Foster private sector incentives and regional collaboration. Build a pertinent model of sustainability rooted in heritage and resilience. And I end with a quote: just as the Arabian onyx, the Mahal Arabi, was rescued from extinction, so too can our cities be reborn, inshallah. And we talk about the fact that we are talking about a very educated and religious and optimistic and young population, and we can do all of this, inshallah. I don't think it's going to be too much of a challenge if we can put our minds to it. And I give a special thanks, of course, to the various news networks, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, Al Hadath, so on, that have given me these resources. OECD Labs at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Reuters, Gallup, ShareCloud, BBC, a Dr. Shu researcher who wrote about this paper in great excess about the human threshold of the environment. And the Environmental Assessment and Rectification Board of Riyadh and environs, which is obviously Baladia for Riyadh, that was very helpful in their website. And I leave it, of course, to the doctor, inshallah, if we have any questions or participations. I'll be very, very pleased to help and answer, inshallah. And thank you so very much for your listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much, Majid, for your thought-provoking, insightful, presentation. And I'm opening the floor for anyone who has any questions. While I'm waiting for someone to ask, Majid, thanks a lot for this project and this presentation. It's kind of insightful and inspiring, and hopefully in the future they adapt some of the things that you presented today. So I have a question for you. So I wrote an article about the SPS, which is Sanitary Agreement within the WTO World Trade Organization, and then there are have been many cases between European beef case and Japan apple case and Australian salmon case. Basically, the agreement, the countries try to put some restrictions on exporting and importing goods from these countries because they don't apply or comply with the sanitary agreement within WTO. The big challenge is that the climate change will impact some of the countries around the globe, and there's kind of non-compliance with these countries about the SPS agreement, and then they put some restrictions on the goods from these countries because they're not in compliance with the SPS agreement. The question is, do you think it would be beneficial to include this agreement along to your article, so to see if we can also integrate this kind of compliance and also this law into your article, and then say, hey, this kind of the agreement within WTO, you need to be cognizant of this law. Therefore, you have to have like some kind of instructor and also some expert in this area to help you out to be in compliance with the SPS agreement, down the road, you will be able to export and import any goods from any other countries around the globe. I'm more than happy to send you my article if you'd like to look at it. But I don't know if this is something that could be considered in your article or in your presentation.
Yes, of course. And يعني أولا أحييك والله يسعدك لهذا السؤال والمنطقة. And I think that in terms of course, the article, I would be very, very interested in receiving it from you, certainly. And in terms of your question, I think it's a very interesting question. And I will say, I'll preface by saying that in terms of the SPS agreement with the WTO, while I think I've heard of it before, I've never really read it directly, and so I will just preface that. But in terms of this discussion about using the dynamics of economics, of, for example, not importing something from a certain country, this has been talked with at length, and it was one of the main discussion points, for example, in the COP, Council of Parties of Nations in Paris, and in recently, and before that even. This is a very strenuous topic that I personally think needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. I think in the GCC world, for example, we are all very advanced economies, alhamdulillah. And in terms of our ability to satisfy the consumer need of a foreign country, we have the ability. But now you're talking about we as GCC countries are unfortunately a little bit behind in the environmental space, despite our great potential. Would it help to have a foreign push? I will speak in 2 points. The first point is, as an international observer, I would say yes, theoretically speaking, this would be very helpful to have a push in the COP of Nations. That if I'm asking, for example, a push from United States or China to reel back some of the polluting activities, then I think it will work on the GCC. But I give you a second point that contradicts the first point. As a Saudi and as a member of this country and this region, I think that it can be dangerous for us to consider these ideas because we are an export-based economy. And if we are an export-based economy, we have to balance between the needs of our citizens and denizens and the needs to abide by environmental desires. So I think it's a difficult situation that we have to study and try to negotiate with the foreign countries to give us, for example, a 10-year plan or a 5-10-year plan to be able to advance environmentally while at the same time preventing grievous harm to our citizens and denizens. And I hope that that was a satisfactory answer, Professor Bender.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you again. We have just 2 minutes left. I don't know if someone would like to ask any questions or jump in to say anything, or maybe, some suggestions, some ideas or comments or feedback, or we have 2 minutes left. Would be happy to listen to you. Just maybe raise your hand or maybe just jump in and then let us know. I'm looking at the chat right now to see I'm not missing anyone. Okay, I haven't seen anyone say anything. Let me look at the screen to see if someone would like to jump in.
I think الزميل معاذ has a question. الله يحفظه.
Go ahead.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
جزاك الله خير Majid. It's an informative presentation. It's a simple and direct question. I mean, do you think these plans of diversifying economy has any factor or intersect with the idea that you are trying to present?
Sure. Yeah, Allah يسعدك. Jazakallah بالسؤال. I think yes, because when we're talking about economic diversification, you're talking about the reality of the GCC. You're talking about the most intensive hydrocarbon exporter in history ever. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, as we talked about, but environmentally it is quite destructive. And if we are talking about the diversification of the economy towards other sectors like manufacturing, tourism, investments, so on and so forth, then we are able to draw, yes, of course, intensive industries require hydrocarbon resources, and yes, of course, there is pollution associated, no doubt. But when you're talking about the broad harms environmentally, I think there's actually some amount of amelioration or some amount of reduction of harm when we transition بإذن الله تعالى through these programs and plans. وأتمنى إن شاء الله يعني الإجابة كانت سليمة يعني.
شكرا أخوي ماجد، انتهى وقتنا المحدد لهذه الجلسة، وجزاك الله خير على هذا المقال الجميل وعلى هذا العرض الرائع، ونسأل الله أن يبارك فيك وأن يجعل ما تقدم إن شاء الله تعالى في ميزان حسناتك. Thank you to our presenter for a thought-provoking and insightful discussion, as well as to our participants for the engaging questions as well that we have today. And as a reminder to all of us, this session invited us to look beyond climate policy as a matter of targets and technology, and instead consider this deeper institutional legal conditions that shape whether mitigation is actually feasible. And with that, we conclude this session. Thank you all for being here.